Job chapter 28 this morning, as we continue in this series in the book of Job. Job chapter 28, beginning at verse 1, we'll read the whole chapter. God's word says this: There is a mine for silver, and a place where gold is refined. Iron is taken from the earth, and copper is smelted from ore. Mortals put an end to the darkness. They search out the farthest recesses for ore in the blackest darkness. Far from human dwellings they cut a shaft, in places untouched by human feet. Far from other people they dangle and sway. The earth from which food comes is transformed below as by fire. Lapis lazuli comes from its rocks, and its dust contains nuggets of gold. No bird of prey knows that hidden path. No falcon's eye has seen it. Proud beasts do not set foot on it, and no lion prowls there. People assault the flinty rock with their hands, and lay bare the roots of the mountains. They tunnel through the rock. Their eyes see all its treasures. They search the sources of the rivers and bring hidden things to light. But where can wisdom be found? Where does understanding dwell? No mortal comprehends its worth. It cannot be found in the land of the living. The deep says, "It's not in me." The sea says, "It's not with me." It cannot be bought with finest gold, nor can its price be weighed out in silver. It cannot be bought with the gold of Ophir, with precious onyx or lapis lazuli. Neither gold nor crystal can compare with it, nor can it be had for jewels of gold. Coral and jasper are not worthy of mention. The price of wisdom is beyond rubies. The topaz of Cush cannot compare with it. It cannot be bought with pure gold. Where then does wisdom come from? Where does understanding dwell? It is hidden from the eyes of every living thing, concealed even from the birds in the sky. Destruction and death say, "Only a rumor of it has reached our ears." God understands the way to it, and he alone knows where it dwells. For he views the ends of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. When he established the force of the wind and measured out the waters, when he made a decree for the rain and a path for the thunderstorm, then he looked at wisdom and appraised it. He confirmed it and tested it. And he said to the human race, "The fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding." We thank God for his living and his life-giving word. I wonder how you feel about window shopping. How do you feel about window shopping? Just think that in your heads for a moment. How do you feel about window shopping? Do you know what I feel about window shopping? I despise it. I really do not like window shopping. I know some people like the experience of looking at different things available and going from window to window. I've never really understood it. I think it stems back to whenever I was a teenager. And, my friends and I would be killing time on a Saturday afternoon down the town in Bangor where I grew up, going past shop windows, going into shops, looking down aisles, looking through little glass boxes, staring in wonder at lots and lots of wonderful things that we could have, but none of them that we could afford. I think that's why I don't like window shopping. We would inevitably leave on a Saturday afternoon in utter frustration at all these wonderful things that we could have, but we couldn't afford. If you were to summarize window shopping for me, it's a case of, well, you can look, but you can't touch. You can look, but you can't touch. And the passage that we just read in Job chapter 28, it has a similar sense of frustration about it. Because the author of Job and Job 28, he takes us, as it were, cosmic window shopping. He comes with us on a journey to look at the most precious item in the universe, namely wisdom. But it's a case of you can look, but you can't touch. We're going to see that frustration in just a moment. But it's helpful first, before we dive into the passage, to stand back, as it were, from this chapter and think about why this chapter is in the book of Job at all. In actual fact, if we've been reading from the beginning of Job up until chapter 28, chapter 28 comes as like a welcome diversion, a welcome distraction from the endless arguments that we had been hearing up to chapter 28. We've been journeying with Job so far along this terrible path of suffering that he's been going through. We began this series by looking in chapter 1 as God gives Satan terrible permission over Job to do him harm, such that this blameless servant Job, the greatest man of the East, is reduced to the ash heap. In 2 strikes, he loses both his wealth and then his health. Then his 3 friends showed up in order to offer him comfort. But instead of comforting him, they torment him. They enter into nearly 9 rounds of heated argument. 9 times back and forth. One of the friends speaks, then Job responds. One of the friends speaks, then Job responds. It's wearisome. I say nearly 9 rounds because by the time we come to chapter 25, Bildad's words get reduced to just 6 verses. And then the other friend, Zophar, he doesn't even bother to respond to Job anymore. It feels like the arguments just peter out. But we've come to chapter 28 with 9 rounds of these arguments, but we're no better off for it. We're still puzzled, trying to understand why Job is going through what he's going through. And then we come to chapter 28. And breaking through all of the puzzle and the questions, finally we get some light shed on the situation. A bit of direction that will help us on the rest of our journey through the book of Job. Now this poem, as it is in chapter 28, it's structured in 3 parts. So we're going to look at each of those parts in turn. We're going to see first a difficult but vital quest in verses 1 to 11. And second of all, we'll see a vital but impossible quest from verses 12 to 22. And then part 3, we'll see our quests end verses 23 to 28. So let's look at that first part, a difficult but vital quest, verses 1 to 11. Well, the rich poetry that we've seen throughout this book of Job, it's on full display here again. As the narrator, he takes us down into a mine. Look again at chapter 28, verses 1 and 2. There is a mine for silver, and a place where gold is refined. Iron is taken from the earth, and copper smelted from ore. Precious metals like gold and silver, and iron and copper, they're all found buried underground. He speaks of precious stones in verse 6 and other treasures in verse 10. Beneath our feet are items of extreme worth and value, just waiting to be discovered. But the problem is, they're not easily discovered, are they? They're not easily extracted from the earth. Look at verses 3 and 4. Mortals put an end to the darkness. They search out the farthest recesses for ore in the blackest darkness. Far from human dwellings, they cut a shaft in places untouched by human feet. Far from other people, they dangle and sway. You see, before the invention of the light bulb, darkness was a much bigger problem, wasn't it? We all experienced this a number of weeks ago, didn't we? Whenever we had the blackouts. And we all experienced what it's like to stumble around in the dark again without power. It's very hard to find things in the dark, isn't it? And so mining is hard because it's dark. But it's also dangerous. The picture in verse 4 speaks of these miners here perilously dangling over a mine shaft. And it helps us capture the huge risks that miners take even to the present day. You know, even today with all our health and safety policies and procedures, mining is still a very dangerous pursuit. In fact, in just the week gone by, on Monday in Spain, there were 5 miners tragically killed in Spain, 4 others injured. Even to the present day, mining is dangerous. In verse 9, it says that the miners assault the flinty rock with their hands. This exposure to the bare rock with bare hands, it reinforces this danger. Mining is dark. Mining is dangerous. And furthermore, mining is lonely. Do you see that in verse 4? It speaks of these mine shafts being far from human dwellings, in places untouched by human feet. People don't tend to live in mines, do they? No, they just go there to do their job and then return home to be around people again. Mining is dark. Mining is dangerous. Mining is lonely. But despite all of this, we still mine. Why? Because there's treasure to be found. The items that we search for are of great value. And so far in the book of Job, it's a little bit like we've been on a mining exploration with Job. Job has entered the mine of suffering and hardship, and he is on a quest for answers. Back in chapter 3, we saw Job cry out, why, as he cries out to God, looking for answers in the midst of the darkness and the suffering that he's going through. He questions why he was even born to have to face such suffering. Here is a man who has descended down into the dark and dangerous and lonely pit of suffering. And yet down in that pit, there are treasures to be found. James writes in the New Testament, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." James here points to one way that God uses trials and suffering in our lives. He wants to bring about maturity in us. You see, God knows that sometimes the only way that maturity and growth can happen in our lives is whenever we descend down into the mine shaft of suffering and hardship. Now, by our own choice, we would never choose to go down there. And yet, when we are forced down into the mine, what do we often find? We often find there are treasures to be found that we would never have had up above on surface. Think about those times of hardship that you faced in your own life so far. Although you never would have chosen to go through those times of hardship, I can guarantee this for every single believer who's been through hardship. You will have discovered things during that period of your life that you never would have discovered in the good times. A broken relationship that caused you to draw closer to your relationship with God. A job loss or a financial hardship that caused you all the more to lean into your Heavenly Father's provision for you. A family tragedy, the death of a loved one, that caused you to remember your own mortality all the more. A sickness that came into your body that caused you to long for that new body in heaven afresh. See, these are lessons that we learn that cannot be learned when things are going well in our lives. It's only down the dangerous and dark and oftentimes lonely pit of suffering that we find these things out. So first, we've seen a difficult but vital quest, but now I want us to see, second of all, a vital but impossible quest. And this is particularly in verses 12 to 22. See, mining has been shown to be dark and dangerous, and yet nonetheless worthwhile. But just when we think we're getting somewhere in this part of Job, all of a sudden he throws in a curveball to catch us off guard. Look at verse 12. But where can wisdom be found? Where does understanding dwell? Look down at verse 20 as well. Where then does wisdom come from? Where does understanding dwell? Where is wisdom? Where is understanding? It's said twice in order to help us to see and to reinforce the vital nature of this quest. Wisdom simply must be found because wisdom is of incomparable value to anything else. It's almost as though the writer is holding up wisdom like a precious diamond for us to gaze upon, examine, and desire. In verse 13, he says that no mortal can comprehend its worth. It's a priceless commodity. Except it's not a commodity at all because it can't be bought, verse 15, with gold or silver. In verse 18, the price of wisdom is beyond rubies. Even if we owned all the tea in China, or indeed all the cattle in Cavan, we would never have enough to buy wisdom. The writer has held up wisdom for us like a precious diamond to show us just how valuable and precious it is. The search for wisdom is a vital search. And yet it's also an impossible search. Look at verses 13 and 14 again. No mortal comprehends its worth. It cannot be found in the land of the living. The deep says, it's not in me. The sea says, it's not with me. Look down at verse 21. It is hidden from the eyes of every living thing, concealed even from the birds in the sky. Destruction and death say, only a rumor of it has reached our ears. You see, although we might go exploring for wisdom over land or into the seas, we won't find wisdom there. Indeed, although we might go to the place of destruction and death, Abaddon, we might go down to the dead, but they've only heard a rumor. They don't know where it is. So the point is simple, that no matter what we might do, and no matter where we might go, no matter how deep our pockets might be, no matter how determined our plans, we will not get wisdom by ourselves. We will not get wisdom by ordinary human means. And how much we need to be reminded of that today. Because we live in a world that is under the illusion that somehow wisdom can be obtained by our human means. We think that with our great universities and with the brightest minds on earth, we can make ourselves wise. But no matter how much investment we might put into our R&D departments, no matter how full our bookcases may get, no matter how far AI might go, or no matter how advanced our machines might become, we need to know that this kind of wisdom that's being described here cannot be obtained by our own means. I mean, isn't that why, despite all of our modern advances, we still are unable to solve the most basic of human problems? I mean, isn't it ironic that in a world that is so full of machines, we've never had more machines involved in our lives, all of these machines that are supposed to make our lives more easier, and yet we've never been busier? Isn't it sadly ironic in a world where we have all the technology to communicate and to make us better connected than ever before, and yet we've never felt more lonely? Isn't it sad that in a world full of distractions made by so-called wise people, we have never been more bored, never more depressed, never more anxious than we are today in the 21st century? And despite all these things, we are still arrogant enough to claim that we are the smartest generation that ever lived. Perhaps it's time we took our gaze off of ourselves. Perhaps it's time we started having a look for wisdom somewhere else. Indeed, that's what Job 28 is trying to show us. The writers held up the priceless diamond of wisdom, showed us how valuable it is. But then it's almost like a magician. He's hidden that diamond away because we can't find it ourselves. And so by the time we come to the end of verse 22, it's like we're on the edge of our seats in anticipation. Wisdom is so valuable. Wisdom we must have. But where can we find wisdom? And we need some of that wisdom because we're fed up with our wisdom of ourselves. And so we come to our quest's end. Third part, as we look at verses 23 to 28. Have a look at verse 23 again. God understands the way to it, and he alone knows where it dwells. Where is wisdom? It's with God. It's with God. And at this point, there is a sense of frustration here with this answer. It's almost like the writer has taken us cosmic window shopping, looking for the most precious thing in the universe, but we've landed at God's shop. It's with God, and it's almost as though we can look, but we can't touch. God has wisdom. He alone understands the way to it. He alone knows where it dwells. None of us are able to get a full handle on God's wisdom. None of us has the capacity to know what he knows. But as frustrating as our quest's end might seem, it's exactly where we need to be. Because as we land at God's shop front and realize that wisdom is with him and with him alone, well, then there's only one response left: to bow down and worship. Look at verse 28. And he said to the human race, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding. This is the God who, verse 24, views the ends of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. This is the God who, verse 25, determines how hard the wind blows and measured out the waters. This is the God who, verse 26, decrees where the rain falls and where the thunderstorms shall go. This is the God who controls all that happens in the universe. He alone has wisdom, and he alone is capable of fully possessing it. And so when we come to our quest's end, we bow in worship before God. Verse 28, wisdom is found in fearing God and shunning evil. Fear God and shun evil. And if we've been reading Job from the very beginning, that should ring some bells for us. Because we've heard that line before, fear God and shun evil. It was at the very beginning of the book of Job. In fact, the very first verse of the book of Job, where we read this in chapter 1, verse 1. In the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. Job is presented to us in the book as a wise man. He is a wise man. Why? Because he fears God and he shuns evil in his life. And as Job has been thrown down the mine shaft of suffering, as he's groping for answers in the midst of the darkness and the pain that he's experienced, Job has been brought back to where he started. Wisdom is this: fear God and shun evil. Of course, in the midst of suffering, it's natural that we should question God's wisdom in it. It's natural that, like Job, we would cry out, why, in wonder and puzzlement. Because whenever we are suffering, it doesn't feel much like wisdom to us, does it? But if the wise sufferer Job shows us anything, it's this. It's that God's wisdom is actually made known to us in the midst of suffering. God's wisdom is actually revealed to us in the midst of suffering. Listen to these words from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 21 to 24. They'll come up on the screen. For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Jews demand signs, and Greeks look for wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. Paul's explaining here how the message of the cross seems to be foolishness to the world. And understandably so. Which of us would come up with the plan that the eternal Son of God would have to suffer and die on the cross for his sinful creatures? Which of us would come up with that plan? It seems like foolishness to the world. That's why the message of the cross, writes Paul, seems stupid foolishness to unbelievers. But to us who believe, what has God enabled us to see? That Christ is the wisdom of God. It is through Christ's sufferings that God's wisdom is ultimately revealed to us. And for us who have fled to Christ for salvation, what we have found is priceless treasure. Treasure beyond compare. And does that mean that whenever we suffer, we know all the reasons why we're suffering? No. Does that mean that somehow we can just coast through suffering as though we're just sitting in a classroom? No. Of course not. But it does mean that whenever we do suffer, we can trust him, even if we don't see all the reasons why we're suffering. For if the wisdom of God is most fully displayed at the cross of Christ, in the suffering of the Son, if that's where God's wisdom is most fully displayed, then we can gladly boast like Paul. Boast in our weaknesses. Boast in our suffering. Suffering is like being down a mine shaft. It is dark. It is painful. Sometimes and often it's lonely. But there is treasure down there. Treasure that cannot be found anywhere else, namely wisdom. And what is wisdom? It's to fear God and to shun evil, to trust in God and to turn away from sin. And when we come to the end of ourselves and realize that God alone is the one who has all the reasons for our suffering, when we come to that place, then we are exactly where we're supposed to be. We humbly worship the God who knows best. We humbly worship the God who, for the sake of us sinners, caused his sinless Son to suffer on the cross. So in the midst of all our suffering, let's humbly worship our wise God. Even if only we can peer through the window for now, we can trust that he knows what he's doing with our suffering. Let us trust in him this day and every day. Amen. Amen.